probably other people as well. I think we might be ready to start. What do we think? Sounds like a good time. So I would like to formally and informally say hello and welcome to this webinar for what I'm sure will be an illuminating conversation. And, you know, here we are all on Zoom in a pandemic, with the Chancellor yesterday talking of a very sobering 2.6 million people who'll be unemployed by the middle of next year. So the discussions to come about the benefit cap, a policy that was supposed to incentivize work, couldn't be more timely, particularly today, on the day we've learned that the numbers of people subject to it have gone up by 8% since May. So just a few key things to flag before we start properly with our speakers. This webinar is part of a research programme funded by the Nuffield Foundation, looking at experiences of welfare reform among larger families. It focuses on the benefit cap and the 2-child limit. And the research is a partnership between the Universities of York, Oxford and LSE and the Child Poverty Action Group. And all the presentations will be kept fairly short, I'm sure you'll be pleased to know, and there will be lots and lots of time for questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom. So do add questions into that Q&A and comments in the chat. We're recording this webinar and we'll share it online afterwards. And if you want to tweet, like many people do, tweet using the hashtag #benefitcap. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest in this topic. And before we start properly with a speech from someone, a talk from someone, I'm going to invite Ruth, who's going to run an online poll. So go for it, Ruth.
Thank you, Katie. And just to say in advance, I bear all responsibility for any technological glitches, so it's all down to me. So the reason we nearly didn't have Devon is down to me, and yeah, just blame me for anything like that. Right, so I'm going to try and run this poll now, so you can see, you should be able to see it. I can allow panelists to vote as well, so you should see that on your screen. So just choose which one you think best applies to you.
I can't see it on my screen.
You can't see it. Sometimes panelists can't see it. So sometimes it's only for the, so if I launch it now, you should be able to see it now.
Yeah, I see it. Well,
yes.
yes.
I led into that well, didn't I, with it being technological problems. And then I think I can see people voting now. So I'll let it run for a minute to let people decide and to vote.
Yes, hopefully everyone can see it and have a look at that and decide what you think your answer is. And then I think, Ruth, we're coming back at the end to see if people have changed their minds.
Exactly. We're just going to see if people change their mind. And it may be a few of you struggle to see it on your devices, but I think a lot of you are seeing, because I can see already 185 people have voted. So I'm going to let it run for just like a couple more seconds. Right, I'm going to end it now. So I can share the results now. So just to say at the moment, it's interesting to see we've got a very large majority that say it should be scrapped altogether, but also we have got a range of views. So let's see, and we'll come back to that again at the end. Okay.
Well, a range of views is what we like, particularly in the media, that's what we like. And I am here to introduce first, I'm delighted to introduce Aurora, who is speaking on behalf of herself, obviously, but also on behalf of a group called COVID Realities, which is a research project looking into the experiences of parents and carers on low incomes during the pandemic. So Aurora, I'm very happy to hand over to you.
Hello there, I'm Aurora. I'm a solo widowed parent to 2 children. We're affected by the benefit cap. Before, I was working part-time with a hospitality agency, but due to the pandemic, that has ceased, employment has ceased. So I was widowed when my children were 4 and the other one was 8. I've been affected by multiple changes up to the benefit system. So the benefit cap, I'm penalised having an extra bedroom, and I live in London, so my rent it's really high. Up until we are made homeless, there is no other way I can escape it. The rent alone is 95% of the cap, and I'm also not, it means I'm not eligible for the £20 weekly uplift, which it has changed, I believe, due to the budget. I found COVID realities on social media through following the Child Poverty Action Group. After reading about it, I decided participating in COVID realities would be the perfect opportunity to be heard and address the situation. Though I do hope the general situation continues to be addressed. I found the particular pandemic, it's been isolating. We haven't had very much money. We can't afford to do things. And we really struggle. Poverty can affect any one of us at any time. For us, it's taken a bereavement, but it could take domestic violence or a job loss or an illness, even in the family. And that is evident, and with the pandemic, that's evident now, that there are increasing families. Sorry.
All right, you're doing so well. It's really, really, really helpful to hear all this, and I'm so sorry. Would you like us to take questions? Shall I ask you a question?
It's been a very difficult time. Sorry, is there a question?
No, I was just going to say, would you like a question, or are you happy to keep going?
No, I have a question, please.
Yeah. Well, I'll ask a question before, and anyone else obviously can put a Q&A, put it in the Q&A, but it's just, you talk about isolation, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. And somebody's already put that on the chat. It's so great to hear from you, and it's really brave of you to do that. So thank you very much. And actually the chat is now many people saying thank you, Aurora. So definitely thank you to you. I mean, isolation is such a big deal for everybody during this pandemic, but it sounds, we know that it's just even harder if you're alone and if you're struggling financially, as so many people are at the moment. That thing you said, 95% of the cap is your rent. That
Yes.
Must be a problem for so many people. What do you think? How do you think the policy should change? We've got this poll at the moment.
Well, the cap should be lifted. It should be lifted. I think it was only implemented for austerity measures, wasn't it? Originally, the cap was 20. This is in London. I know it's different elsewhere, but originally it was 26,000, and then all of a sudden they cut it for absolutely no reason. There was no reason for them to cut it, and for some reason, the policy went through Parliament, and all of a sudden we were capped. I haven't always been on universal credit. I was on legacy benefits up until a temporary job ended. So I was put on it as soon as I had this temporary job, and everything else. And since then, I'm in a lot of debt for certain things. I can't even afford to buy certain necessities such as school uniform. We've been given bits and pieces, but children, they grow very quickly. I've been using credit to buy things like shoes. It's never ending.
And does it feel like anybody's listening? I mean, someone here has someone on the group has said, Bhavani Sarma's asking, have you been able to get any help from your local authority, local welfare provision, discretionary housing payments, council tax hardship funds? There are some things out there, but have you been able to access them at all, if you don't mind us asking?
No, I haven't. Because, I mean, for food-wise, we're okay because I'm fortunate enough to have family support. But other than that, no, I've just not. I've had discretionary housing payments before, and I think those lasted for 3 months. I could access them again, but again, I'd have to call the council and do all these things. And sometimes it's just a bit much at the moment. It's just, everything is never ending. Sometimes you don't think of these things. I know I probably should, but
you've got a lot on your plate.
Yes. I mean, they've automatically taken off my council tax, I noticed the other day, because I was in a bit of a worry that I couldn't afford to pay it. And then when I looked, because last year I I had overpaid by £70. So that was a good thing. And then there was there was some money as well that they took off because of the pandemic, which was helpful.
And you were talking earlier about how it was only supposed to be temporary, the benefit cap. Someone's asked a question, which is, you know, do you feel that you were consulted or anyone in government asked your opinion or your thoughts on the benefit cap or any of the COVID changes?
No, none whatsoever. No, we've been, it's been pretty quiet. They're talking about the £20 uplift, and I've received lots of information upon that. But for people who are capped, it's almost as if we're invisible. I think COVID realities is changing that. It's helping us to be heard as a group, and an increasing group by the looks of it. I don't think people realise the impact that it has on people like us. You know, I never envisaged this. This was never meant to be our future. It's just life. Life happens.
Can you see a way out of it?
Well, I suppose working you would think that working would be the better option. At the moment, that's not an option unless I found. It's really difficult also with the children being at school, and the fact that they have to isolate if somebody has, as you all know. So I'm isolated with them, and that would be very difficult from a childcare point of view, because although I have family, I have parents, they are also vulnerable.
And someone's asking about, you know, access to, has there been a knock-on effect? What's been the knock-on effect of the cap or other benefit limits in terms of accessing services like health, welfare assistance, work, anything else? I mean, you were talking about work. Well,
the effects of the cap.
That's what they're asking. Perhaps Patrick, if you could explain that question a bit more. And someone else has asked, yes, that's Patrick who put the question up. Maybe he could send us a question a bit more.
I mean, it doesn't propel me anymore to want to work, because I can only do as much as I'm doing at the moment. I'm applying for jobs, although I know that I might not be able to work because of the children in quarantine on occasion. Since I think they've had since September, we've already had 2 bouts of quarantine. That's 3 weeks in total, because it was one class and then it was another class, seeing as I have 2 children. So that would have been 3 weeks off work. Who would employ me? And not only that, there's not a provision anyway for children for after school clubs after 6 o'clock. What kind of work would I be able to find between those times?
So it feels very much like things that were bad already are much worse as a result, obviously, of the pandemic, and at a time when there aren't the jobs out there anyway, and as you say, your children are having to self-isolate, and so are you. Yes. This is not the time to heap this misery on the family. Yes. Aurora, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that the Q&A and the chat function is completely bombarded with people saying how amazing you are and well done, and thank you so much for sharing it. So thank you very, very much. I'm gonna stop it there because we've got a lot of people to get through, and you may well have some questions for some of them, like the rest of us do. The next people that we're going to hear from are Aaron Reeves and Kitty Stewart. Kitty is Associate Professor of Social Policy and Associate Director of the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the LSE. And Aaron is Associate Professor at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. And they've done a big study on welfare reform and larger families. So I'll hand over to them, please.
Thank you very much. So Erin and I are going to do a bit of a double act. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the statistics, about the benefit cap itself and the statistics, and then hand over to Erin, who's going to talk about our recent work looking at the impact of the benefit cap on mental health. So just a bit of background. I expect most of you know about the benefit cap, but a bit of detail. It was introduced in 2013 under Chancellor George Osborne. There he is in his chair. And the stated aim, well, one aim was to save money under austerity, but also to incentivise work and to encourage what the government called fairness in the benefit system. So there is Osborne summing that up as the idea that no family should get more from living on benefits than the average family gets from going out to work. So with that goal in mind, the cap was initially set at roughly the average wage, 26,000. As Aurora highlighted, it then after the 2015 election came down to 23,000 in London, 20,000 elsewhere. It applies to workless households, and what that means is households with no paid work or with very limited paid work. So you are earning less than the equivalent of 16 hours a week at the minimum wage. Of course, households may well be doing other really important work, such as looking after children. There's no exemption for being a lone parent, for example, or for having young children. There are exemptions for some disability benefits, and there's a grace period of 9 months. So if you've been in stable work for a year, you then have 9 months without being capped. And one thing that's really notable about the benefit cap is that it breaks the principle that entitlement to social security benefits should depend on what households need. So the idea behind the cap is not that households don't need more than the amount of the cap, but that their need is overridden by other criteria, such as this idea of fairness to taxpayers. Now we've got, just to show you the latest statistics that came out updated this morning, so that we can see what's happened to the cap over time. And what you can see there first is an initial rise when the cap was lowered in 2016, big sharp increase in the number of people that were brought under the cap at that point. And then, of course, you can see really sharp increase as the pandemic takes effect in the lockdown. So after March 2020, we see this really sharp rise. And of course, what's happening there is some people are losing their jobs, people who didn't have stable enough work beforehand to be exempted under the 9-month exemption. Maybe some people are losing, their earnings are dropping, and so they're going below the level at which they're exempt for the cap. They're working fewer hours, even if they're still working. And also, the government, as many people will know, has increased universal credit by £20 a week. And that in itself has pushed some people under the cap. Now, the decision not to abolish the cap during the pandemic means that, of course, it is being applied at a time when there's really no chance of households taking action to get out from under it, to take work or to move into cheaper housing. And it also means that thousands, in fact, tens of thousands of households cannot access this this increase, the £20 uplift to universal credit, or indeed are being pushed under the cap. Statistics from the Child Poverty Action Group this morning suggest that as many as 115,000 households have not benefited at all from that £20 increase because they are already capped. And again, this kind of underlines this idea, this gap between a wedge between what households need and what they are entitled to. So this £20 is recognised by the government as being necessary, and yet many households are not entitled to it and are not benefiting from it. And yet the same rhetoric about fairness between benefit claimants and taxpayers continues to be used by government. So we have a recent, here's a recent statement by Mims Davis, who's a DWP minister, again reiterating this idea that the cap is important. It restores fairness between out of work benefit claimants and taxpayers. So this rhetoric implies a kind of dichotomy between that these two groups are different people. There are benefit claimants and there are taxpayers. And of course, as the pandemic kind of really rams home, these are the same people at different points in time. As Aurora said very eloquently, you know, life happens to people, things can be going well, and then lives get turned upside down. The pandemic has really illustrated that. Now, just to look briefly at who is being capped, there has been a bit of a change in composition of people who, the demographic of people who have been capped. And what you can see here is that initially, the vast majority, almost everybody who was capped, was a household with children. And that's changed a little bit during the pandemic. And you can see the beginning of a sort of a difference between the dark blue line there, which is all capped households in August 2020, and capped households with children. So we're seeing more households which are just single individuals without children being capped now. Nonetheless, it remains the case that most capped households, 85%, have children. Over 60% are lone parents, and 43% are households with a child under the age of 5. It's also worth underlining that what's happening over time is not only that more is increasing. Data statistics show that for more than 2 in 5 households, the household is being capped by more than £50 a week, and that's an increase since the last set of statistics. I'm going to hand over to Aaron now to talk about our work on what this means for households affected.
Thanks, Kitty. And I think what's really crucial for us in terms of thinking about the sort of pandemic backdrop for the benefit cap is that our project really began before we knew that we would be conducting much of this research in the context of a global pandemic, but actually I think really raises some of the challenges that the pandemic poses in the way that it's intersecting with the policy as Kitty has just described. And so for us, one of the kind of really crucial questions that we wanted to unpack was, how has this particular policy, the benefit cap, played out in terms of the mental health and well-being of those that were at risk of being affected by it? And what this graph here does is it sort of zooms in on one part of the graph that Kitty showed earlier, which captures this change to the threshold for the benefit cap around November 2016. So what you see in the early part of the graph through 2015 and 2016 is the number of capped households at that initial threshold that both Kitty and Aurora have spoken about. And then what you see is a very sharp and rapid increase in the number of capped households as that more restrictive threshold was implemented, both in London, but also in other parts of the country. And so we tried to use this particular moment in the life cycle of the policy to understand how this may have played out in terms of well-being and mental health. And what we have done here is drawn on large surveys which were conducted both before and after this particular change, and tried to look at 2 different groups of people and follow them over time. We looked at those who were at risk of being capped, so households like Aurora and many others like them, as you can see here in this graph, but also to compare them to individuals that were not at risk of being capped and the kinds of changes that they experienced. So the headline, I think, from that analysis is encapsulated in this particular figure. So you'll notice on the bottom, we're looking at 2 particular groups, those that were not exposed to the cap and those that were at risk of being exposed to the benefit cap. On the vertical axis, what we're capturing is the change in the probability of reporting mental ill health, comparing both individuals that were interviewed before the cap became more restrictive and then afterwards. So if you look at that not capped group, first of all, what we're seeing here is a small increase in the probability that kind of most people in the population reported experience some mental illness, or mental ill health, so depression-like symptoms or anxiety. But then, when we compare it to that group of people that were at risk of being capped, we see a very different picture. Here, there's a much larger increase in the probability of reporting depressive-like symptoms or anxiety compared to before that cap was made more restrictive. And so we find here a kind of early indication that people who are at risk of being capped have experienced poorer mental health as a result of that policy intervention. But what's, I think, particularly striking about this is that kind of mental health effect emerged kind of gradually after the cap was lowered. So if you focus on the gray line here in this figure at the top, what we see is that a relatively steady picture, the level of mental ill health in the population of people who are at risk of being capped before the cap was lowered. And then after it does, we see that trend change as it increases gradually over this period. And it's so important that Aurora mentioned discretionary housing payments, because we know that they were deployed in quite significant numbers during the early parts of 2017, and then began to diminish in the number of people that were benefiting from those. And it's sort of as slowly the effect of those cuts were felt in the lives of the individuals and families affected that we start to see the pressure mount and manifest itself in the well-being of the people that were affected. And you can see, if we compare that to those who were uncapped, a very different trend. Yes, there's a slight increase, but it's a largely flat trajectory. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, if our models are correct, if our analysis is right, we suggest that around 6,600 additional people began experiencing kind of the symptoms of or depression-like symptoms over this period. But what's really crucial is that this analysis was conducted sort of up to the end of, or the beginning of 2019. And it doesn't include the people that have more recently been exposed to the cap that Kitty was talking about earlier, now around 170,000. And so if we take into account that number, it's a far larger group of people that are potentially experiencing the kinds of difficulties that were brought about by the cap. And then I think if we step back from this, obviously the kind of main finding of our analysis is that the cap has potentially harmed the well-being of individuals and families. But it may have also had this unintended consequence of actually working against the policy objectives. As Katie illustrated at the beginning of our conversation, it was intended to incentivize people to work. But we also know that when people experience some of these mental ill health symptoms, they actually move away from the labour market. It becomes more difficult for them to find work sometimes. And so in fact, it may have actually counterintuitively undermined the policy's objectives. But I think putting that to one side, which is something we can't see directly in our data, what's really, I think, striking about our analysis to this point is that it reveals some of the consequences of severing that link between needs and entitlements. And when you break that down, that families do experience the kinds of insecurity and uncertainty that Aurora was talking about, and that potentially some of that then manifests itself as depression and anxiety and other forms of mental ill health. And I think that's a really crucial message that comes out of our work at this point.
I'm so impressed that you are all sticking to time so perfectly. I was just thinking I perhaps better remind you that you've got to wrap up soon because we need time for questions. And then there you were finishing it. So well done. That was, I mean, you know, you look at a graph, you look at several graphs and you just remember about the people behind them and just think this is a lot of people who are seriously struggling. And I know a lot of people have questions for you. So please do put them on the Q&A. Somebody, Kate Anstey, has put, and I don't know what you do, Kate, but I'm assuming you're a lawyer, because I've had a case, or perhaps a sport worker. I've had a case whereby the COVID universal credit rate increase pushed somebody into the benefit cap. So they were effectively worse off than they'd been when on the lower rate. And I pursued this through pre-action protocol with solicitors, but the DWP's defense is watertight. They use the case from the Supreme Court resting on the deserving, undeserving poor narrative. What are the CPAG doing in the courts to change this perverse policy? Well, that may be a question for the lawyers later, but I just wondered for you, you two and your statistics, have you, I don't know, clearly we're talking about people being pushed into more depression as a result and mental health problems as a result of what's happening. Do you think, have you had any sense from doing your research that the government's listening in any way? That or is the case law tight and they're not going to shift at all?
I think we've had no sense that the government is listening. I mean, what a perfect opportunity to scrap this policy. The pandemic has really shown up the huge flaws in the logic that there is a difference between people who sit around on benefits and people who go out to work, and yet they haven't taken the opportunity to do that, and they continue to use the same rhetoric.
I'd also maybe just add that I think the analysis that we've done is important in one sense, is that it provides some numerical data behind that kind of claim, but this isn't something that we haven't known, that the experiences that Aurora shared and others, have already talked about some of the distress that this type of policy has created and the kinds of problems that people have felt around this. So I think while it's an important perspective that this analysis offers, it's not something that's new. I think we already had a really keen sense that this was playing out in many people's lives, not all, but many.
Callum Smith has a question, which is there any evidence of the impact of the benefit cap being any worse in any particular nation within the UK?
Maybe I should, in terms of the health effects, I can speak to that. I have to say, we find that in our analysis in particular, we find that the areas of the country where the cap has hit hardest, that is in terms of both its numerical impact in the size of the reduction, so people in London, for example, but also the parts of the country where more people were affected by the cap, we see that the mental health effects are larger. And I think it's also fair to say that because of the importance of house prices and rent, it's often in very expensive parts of the country that are expensive to live where this is hitting the hardest. But Kitty might also have insight here too.
No, I think that's right. And initially, it was really, really focused on very much on London and the southeast. When the cap was lowered, when the cap was lowered, it started to have wider effects on other parts of the country too. It's really important to underline that the housing cost is well. I think Aurora made that point very clearly. 95% of her what's being capped it's the housing that's causing that. So it's not that people have £26,000, just in disposable income. And so housing costs are a really important part of driving who is capped and who isn't.
And it's now seems that it's not just in areas with high rents. I mean, Yvonne Bennett has put a question in. The reduced benefit cap means that families with 3 children, even in a low rent area like Swansea, are affected. How is this fair? I'm not sure any of you would be saying it was fair. We haven't got the right people on this Q&A to answer that question, probably. How is it fair? Thomas Weeks, do you know if the published statistics include the people who received the grace period? So that's that 9-month grace period thing. And how long on average is the grace period? For example, if someone newly applied to Universal Credit in April and would be capped, but get the grace period, are they counted in the statistics or are they only counted once the grace period's over? That's detail.
They're not there if they're in the grace period, they're not being capped yet. So what we could expect to see is once these 9 months after the beginning of the pandemic are over, so early in the new year, I think we can expect to see another big increase as more people are affected.
Yeah. And Saskia Nyberg has said this morning's statistics, by which I assume she means the 170,000 statistic that's just come out. This morning's statistics suggest a rise in single childless households as a proportion of capped households, or perhaps that's your statistics. Does anyone have any thoughts on what that tells us about the risks of the benefit cap?
I mean, maybe for me, it says something about how deeply this actually comes down into the spread of people that could potentially be affected, particularly as it plays out in different parts of the country. I think, as Kitty rightly said, and other people on the chat have been saying, initially it was perhaps concentrated on particular demographic, it was in particular parts of the country, but as it's been lowered, its tentacles have sort of spread out into a much more diverse group of people, and potentially with negative consequences for many of those households too.
I mean, what you've just said, Kitty, about what we might expect 9 months after the pandemic when people are in this period of grace, I mean, that is, terrifying and sobering to hear. I know people were asking, do you think anyone's listening? Is this a moment, do you think? I suppose if it was a moment, they would have changed it earlier because we've now been in this pandemic since March. But will people be flagging to them to the government, the fact that 9 months on from when they've seen this spike, there will be another spike? I
think people are flagging it. Yes, I sort of feel like it's trying to find one feels that if you could only put it just in the right words in the right way, it would get through. That I know there was a writer who said that if he'd only been a better writer, the Second World War wouldn't have happened. So sort of slightly feels like we just need to put this more strongly, but I guess just need to keep saying it.
And there's a question which is now going to reveal my total ignorance for acronyms, so I apologise. Yvonne Bennett is asking, what's the justification for people with, is it LCW or ICW? I think it's LCW as opposed to LCWRA being capped when they've been found incapable of work. Does anyone know what that is? I'm sure you all do.
I think it must refer to
CRW is capability for work, so limited capability for work, I believe.
Okay. So thank you, Aurora. Thank goodness you're here for many reasons, for many ways, but that was really helpful. So yes, the question is, what is the justification for people with limited capacity for work or limited capability for work as opposed to LCWRA being capped when they have been found incapable for work? I guess you guys aren't here to justify, but do you know what the justification is?
There isn't.
I think.
Oh, go on, Devon.
I was just going to say, well, I don't think there is a good one. I was just going to. Some of the stats we looked at in London was just a very high proportion of households affected in the limited capability for work group, and also with children under 5, which I think your stats showed, Aaron, and it's just a really disproportionate number of people who wouldn't be expected to look for work anyway under the current regime. And again, it's just one of those arguments against the cap that, again, as Kitty said, if we could just put to the government in the right way, I think they would, to the right person in the right way at the right time, it should be enough to kind of change things. But I think that's where we are. Sorry to jump in. I wasn't sure if that was aimed at. But,
well, it's good to jump in because that feels like a really good moment to move on to you, Devon. This is Devon Galani, I'm sure you all know, who's going to talk about the impact of the benefit cap through the use of administrative data. And he is director of the think tank Policy in Practice. So hello, Devon.
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
And you should be able to see my screen as well, hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I'm just going to go through a very small number of slides, but I just wanted to start. Thanks for inviting me, first of all. It was really interesting to be asked to speak on this because our very first project, so when I started Policy in Practice, it started because Lewisham Council asked me to help them with a project that was related to the benefit cap. Essentially, before the cap was introduced, it was just to try and let residents know that this was coming and what they could do to try and prevent it. And I think a few things that are really interestingly different between when the cap was first introduced and how it's sort of treated now is that in 2013, councils were supported to identify capped households before they were capped, actually provide support, make efforts, make attempts to engage them and help those households into work and essentially meet the stated aim. And I remember working with Lewisham. You can, if the slides are shared, I'll share a link later on. You can actually download the white paper. But there were some really striking quotes from advisors who said, I was really struck by the number of the households that we were previously in zero contact with, the council had no awareness of at all because the housing benefit was just getting paid, and the level of need that we were dealing with. So kind of serious, already in very serious situations with children with perhaps health, mental health, other kind of wider social care needs. And they were kind of, obviously the advisors working on supporting capped households, they were finding some of the work that they were doing really rewarding, which isn't to say in any way that they agreed with a cap, but at least there was support in place to try and help those residents who perhaps should have had that help before. I think one of the things that's kind of very different now is that there are many more people who are capped, which you'll see in a subsequent slide, and there's a lot less support, I think. Okay, there's some money around for discretionary housing payments, but the kind of support that households need and the kind of information local authorities need to identify capped households just really isn't there. And I'll mention that in a moment or two. So you can see the jump in the number of capped households down from a low of 20,000, which essentially was this, I suppose this drop was the effectiveness of that support, the effectiveness of advisors going from sort of 28,000 or so down to 20,000 here. And And then you just see it shoot up as the caps dropped, level of caps dropped, and you can kind of see it just going up to over 140,000 now, with many more households now capped on universal credits. They're seeing one of the rules around the cap is that under universal credit, much more of your benefits can be capped than previously. Under legacy benefits, it was only your housing element that could be capped, which meant that, again, there was some level of limited protection for those households. Under universal credit, that's gone. There is a set limit to the maximum you can receive. So that shows that many more households are capped. I think another point to illustrate this is I thought I'd run my case through the calculator and see whether or not I would be capped. So kind of I put myself in with my wife and 2 kids, and if we were exempt, then this is how much we'd receive. I would be capped immediately if after the grace period. So if I'd lost my job at the start of the pandemic, 9 months later, I would be capped. If I were to move into work, minimum wage, I can't remember what hours I put in, I'd no longer be, the cap would no longer affect me. I'd see a big jump. But then I thought I'd compare it to furlough and say, actually, one of the things that's really interesting is the furlough limit is 30,000 a year, so £2,500 a month times by 12, and the cap limit is 23,000. And I just think there's a really interesting dichotomy of, if you were working recently and put on furlough, there's a maximum that you can receive. Obviously, not everyone receives that maximum because it's 80% of your previous wage, but the maximum is set at 30,000. Whereas under the cap, if you're on benefits, have been out of work for 9 months or more, then it's 23,000. And again, there's this sort of incoherence that is probably, these are the kinds of areas where I think it makes more sense to challenge the government. Because I think another point I wanted to make at the start is, again, when the cap was introduced, it was a remarkably popular policy, right? It was one of the government's most popular policies, actually. I think there's sort of almost 80%, 70 to 80% approval. You've caught me today. I'm actually a juror at the Old Bailey, so I thought I'd poll my fellow jurors on this. And not that it's a particularly representative sample, but it was no longer 80%. It was more like 40% in favor of the cap, or kind of interactions like that. So whatever that tells you. Then kind of moving on to the research we've done, are capped households more likely to enter work? So we delivered evidence to the Work and Pensions Committee. So we've pooled data across London as part of a project with Trust for London, so on over 1 million low-income households. This work was carried out about 18 months ago now. And we looked at kind of households that were capped versus households that just missed out on the cap. And what we found was capped households were more likely to enter work than uncapped households. 21% more likely was what we found. I think the DWP zone analysis has a slightly higher figure from memory. It was around 42%, if I've got that right. But then we thought, because we've got the data ourselves, we were able to ask additional questions. So the next question we asked is, how much of that is to do with support? So are the people who entered work the ones that are actually engaging with the council? And then the next question we asked is, well, okay, for those children whose parents enter work, how many children have parents who haven't been able to enter work and are now living close to destitution as a result, either because their parents can't work or because there's other kind of young children, or some of the examples Aurora gave of, particularly now in a pandemic, your kids are being sent home from school is just hard, particularly now. And what we found is, this is pre-pandemic, for every child whose parents moved into work, there were 8 more children who were stuck on the cap for 6 months or more, and therefore living close to destitution. And what that allowed us to do, and we have these debates within policy and practice, because I always try and argue the government's case. I think when you're challenging policy, you need to challenge it on the government's own terms if you're trying to make a difference. So I was trying to make that case. But I think what this allowed us to do was to say, actually, for the incentives are to, the rationale for the policy is to support parents into work. For every child whose parents enter work, if there was only one child who was living close to destitution, potentially having to move into temporary accommodation as a result, I think you could challenge the policy. When it's 8 children, I think it becomes very difficult to justify just purely in financial terms, outcome terms. And I think it's these kinds of arguments that, again, the government should be pushed to kind of do its own analysis on, or we should be doing more of and putting to the government. I won't spend too much on this slide, or Aurora's made the point, but essentially this is the interaction of the benefit cap and other policies. So this highlights the COVID-19 policies, which again, didn't really do anything for capped households. It meant many more households were capped, because as levels of benefits increased, many more households went above 23,000. But there are a couple of other interactions. So there's these COVID policies. When you think about the interaction of the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, you don't need both policies. You need one or the other, if that's what you're trying to do, right? Most people on the webinar would say you don't need either. But if you're trying to sort of limit the level of benefits, then you wouldn't need both. And then you've got discretionary housing payments, and there's a really interesting statistic, again using the administrative data we've got hold of, which found that for if you apply for a DHP, you're quite likely to get it. So 80% to 90% of DHPs that people apply for, they get. Of those that are most in need, of households that are most in need, i.e. in debt, affected by the benefit cap, of losing kind of significant amounts through welfare reform, through housing-related welfare reforms, only 1 in 5 of those actually apply for a DHP. So there is this gap in identifying need, identifying households that could benefit from this support. And the final slide, you'll be pleased to know, is so looking ahead, I'd say if the benefit cap is to stay in place, and again, I'm sure that will be part of the wider conversation, I think the government needs to enable that support to get to those households in the way that they did in 2013. They need to recognise that the intent of the policy is to support those households who are capped to be able to improve their circumstances. One, can they do it during COVID? Strong case for suspension or raising the level of the cap. Two, they can help local authorities identify capped households. So we use administrative data to do that, but actually better information sharing, particularly on universal credit households. So as people move on to UC, they can be, they're already falling into rent arrears. Councils could start working with them much sooner and be supported to do so, which is a broader point. When you do work with those households, again, the lesson from Lewisham was that advisors were able to make a difference, whether it's recognizing the wider need or supporting residents with access to DHPs, if it's about just steadying the ship, or kind of a wider support to help them, childcare, anything else they might need to help support the parents to find work or stay in work. And then the final point, which I think is really important, and one I'd love to, so I think the benefits of employment, through this administrative data, you can weigh up the benefits of employment need to be weighed against increased arrears, higher temporary accommodation costs, ultimately on children's outcomes and wider mental health needs, as Erin and Kitty's report showed. So if you are going to do this, weigh up the benefits against the costs, because I think on that basis, you start to really challenge the policy on its own terms. So even for the most ardent supporters, I think the in terms of the principle of fairness, when you look at the actual impacts and do the sums, I think there's a lot more there that you could challenge the government with on its own terms.
Need to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Devon. We're going to take a load of questions, and I think we should start perhaps with your unscientific poll of jurors, because various people have asked a sort of wider question on that, which is, well, Ian Scott's saying the cap was very popular with the general public when it was introduced. Has there been any new research to show that this attitude has changed? And then Liam Casey is also saying, in my experience, the Conservative narrative about fairness holds a lot of sway with MPs and voters. Do you agree that this narrative needs to be defeated in order to defeat the cap? And if so, what are the best arguments and strategies for doing this? And obviously you were touching on that in this, but do you have any answers to those wider points?
So I don't have an answer on the latest polling, other than my 12 jurors, just because I didn't have time to look it up. I've been in this trial for 7 weeks, I should add, so I'm sort of slightly stretched. But on the second point, I think, can the case be defeated? I think I'm remembering Kitty's first slide with George Osborne leaning back with that statement. Kitty, can you just read that out again? Because I think it's incredibly powerful. So people on benefits shouldn't get more than the average person who goes out to work, or something along those lines. And I think as a case, that's incredibly powerful. And I don't think it's very easy to defeat on its own terms as a principle. I think attitudes are shifting as people kind of recognize the real impacts. In sort of February, March time, you'll see people who aren't supposed to be capped being capped. Because of the 9-month grace period ending. And I think it's really, the government's response to these things are kind of, I think in itself quite telling. So if you think about the COVID support measures, they're not there for people who have been on benefits for a long time. They don't apply to legacy benefits. There is almost a very deliberate additional support for people who are unemployed through COVID versus those who are, and I think that's almost, which is completely incorrect, because I think what COVID really highlights is that these types of misfortune could happen to any of us, more so than anything else. So I'm not sure, I don't think I'm answering the question that well, Casey, but I just think that one sentence is very, that kind of principle is very hard to argue against. And the government wants to retain that principle in some way, shape or form.
Does anyone else have an answer? Does anyone else, before we move on, to know about the research, whether there has been any research recently on attitudes? No. I mean, anecdotally, slightly on the same point, Devon, I remember filming in a food bank early on, just as lockdown was announced. And there seemed to be a sense that when people were calling up, you know, these whole host of people that we know had to go on universal credit at that point, lots of people were saying that the way that they'd been spoken to, and lots of people in food bank were saying who'd helped them, the support workers, whatever, were saying that actually the attitude of the staff at the other end had been very different from what they'd noticed when people on more long-term benefits had those same engagements. I have no idea whether that's true or not. It's just anecdotal, but that there was a sort of shift in, oh, these are a different kind of people. These are people who are losing their jobs during a pandemic through no fault of their own. This is sort of setting up a kind of dichotomy, which I guess potentially is still there. We've got some other questions for you, Devon, or for any of you really, which is Maeve McGoldrick. Is there any employment support offered when people are being hit by the cap? This was the original intention of the policy. Does anyone know about that?
I think there is some. I think there's far less. So there are still welfare support teams within councils, but I think the level of attention capped households tend to get as a proportion of that is just, it's kind of become the day job. Whereas and it's the same sort of level of support, whether you're affected by under occupation or whether your rent is capped through local housing allowance, or whether that's generally what we see in local authorities. And some do. So this idea of a specialist cap team doesn't really exist. There are some really good examples of strong multidisciplinary teams within local authorities that are there to try and support the household holistically. And I think that can work. You know, there could be a household in very serious debt that isn't capped, and that arguably needs just as much support as a capped household, because it sort of depends on how much you're capped, I guess. And I think there are some really strong examples of local authorities doing really good work there, and some good examples of varied good examples of like interaction with DWP as well. But I just think generally compared to 2013, the attention, level of funding relative to the level of demand and need is considerably less than it was.
And perhaps this question is something to build an argument or hang an argument around for the government. Jeremy Hewer, I thought there'd been a report by the Work and Pension Select Committee in the last Parliament that pointed out that the vast majority of those hit by the cap were through illness or disability, so they weren't able to take up work and escape the cap anyway. I don't know if anyone knows anything about that. But this is a really interesting one perhaps to end these questions on, which is, do you have any idea of the cost to support people who are capped via other services? So that sense, lots of people are messaging about this, in fact, that sense that, you know, as we always hear, you know, you're saving money in one area, and I don't know how much the benefit cap saves, but you're saving money in one area, but then you're having to spend an awful lot more on mental health services, you know, whatever else it might be. And has there been any work done on the costs of that?
Yeah, if I can come in on that, Casey, essentially the costs are considerably higher in terms of supporting people who are capped. If you get an eviction, that costs about £8,000 just to process the application. On top of that, you're paying additional costs in temporary accommodation or discretionary housing payments. So essentially, you're bridging that cost anyway. It might not appear in the DWP benefits budget, but it does appear through discretionary housing payments. And I think these are the kinds of questions, sort of slightly dull way of going about it. And we can do this kind of analysis for individual local authorities as well. The argument often then says, okay, well, if local authorities, you're saving this much because you're not having to pay out the additional and temporary accommodation, why should we, central government, have to pay you for that support? Because we've created a situation whereby you should be providing this, you know, there are incentives now for you to kind of avoid homelessness because we've created it, which is a very roundabout and very negative argument. And it sounds absolutely ridiculous me saying it. But that is kind of that is in a part the kind of argument people are in. And the wider cost to society also just needs to be, it's not just about fiscal costs of additional cost of homelessness, additional cost of temporary accommodation. We are leaving out here a very important picture that Aaron highlighted of actually just mental pressure, and this idea that I think Aurora made out, like you can't necessarily look any harder for work or be in a better position to look for work when you're worried about the debts that are building up or paying next week's rent. So there are some basic needs that need to be sorted out before employment support becomes really the next step.
Well, thank you, Devon. And I'm now going to introduce Professor Donald Hirsch, who's the Director of the Centre for Research and Social Policy at Loughborough University, who's going to talk to us about the growing bite of the benefit gap. Donald.
Okay, I'll just share my screen. Okay, share. Okay, is that coming up?
Yep, that's good. That's up.
Okay, right. Okay, slideshow. Okay, so yes, I mean, just to put this in some context, I'm going to talk about how I think there's been a real transformation, and we've heard a bit about it already since the benefit cap was first introduced in terms of its bite. But I mean, the context is that our team at Loughborough work on the minimum income standard, which shows that even before you're capped, benefits are not nearly enough to, out of work benefits are not nearly enough to allow people to have the minimum that they need to meet their material needs and participate in society. And that when we started looking at this a decade ago, they were fell about a third short of doing that, and now it's sort of getting closer to a half, certainly over 40%. So even before the benefit cap, people are starting with benefits which are not enough. So anybody who's capped is really being brought into a very difficult situation in those terms. But when it was first introduced, I think it was really targeted at larger families, and particularly people who had higher rents. And if you look at my simple graphs are going to show these bars which show what your basic benefits are on universal credit plus child benefit. This is the sort of the non-housing bit of out of work benefits. And you can see that when it was first introduced and up until just before it was reduced in late 2016, that if you had 4 children, you were getting quite close even without any rent. But if you had 2 children, you were still this would be a couple. This is the example of a couple with 2 children. They would be quite a long way short. But if you then added on rent, an average council rent would take you just about up to being capped. So most tenants, if you had 4 children and you were even in local authority accommodation, you'd be starting to hit that cap. But it really, if you had a low or an average rent, it would be worse. And then if you had a high rent, obviously, even with 2 children, you could. But this is in the highest local authority outside London, which is actually Guildford. So really it would be pretty exceptional that a couple with 2 children would be capped, but much more normal if you were a couple with 4 children. So if you then jump ahead to the period immediately after the cap was reduced, you see that line, that bold line coming down and hit cap hitting a lot more people. So that a lot more of the 3-child families, a couple with 3 children, would be very likely, if they were a tenant, to be hit by the cap. And now it's gone further because those basic levels have increased, as we've said, with the £20 increase in universal credit. And so even with an average council rent, it's starting to hit couples with 2 children. And of course, the higher the rent you get, the more you're going to lose, and the more you're going to fall short, as we've heard, this terrible situation that Aurora is in, where it just doesn't come close to covering your rent and your other needs. And this is, I've produced in a blog some other examples So people who are interested in the numbers can look at them, and it's even for lone parents who obviously have got a slightly lower entitlement, it's hitting as well. If you've got even an average local housing, an average private rent, it's hitting people even with 2 children. And so what this is really showing is that something which started out as being sort of look at these people who are unusual, and they've got exceptionally high benefit entitlements either because they've got a large family or a high rent. It's just not about that anymore. And indeed, I think that it's very dishonest to even pretend that it's about sort of having people who have a higher entitlement than an average worker. It never was true, actually, because an average worker with a family would be a lot better off than was being projected, because they would have in-work entitlements anyway. But really, what I think we're moving towards is a situation where even without the 2-child limit, which incidentally is only coming in gradually, it's becoming the norm to be capped. And even when the 2-child limit comes in, the fact that it's reducing benefits even below what a couple with 2 children would be entitled to, means that it'll even add to that cut that you get with the 2-child limit. And I mean, apart from the obvious point that this is going to create desperate situations for many people, and increasingly so, I think what we really also need to take on board, and what this really shows, is that if we continue to reverse austerity in small ways, or at least don't make it worse by for example, re-indexing benefits, which has happened this year, and also we're hoping that the £20 increase will become permanent, in which case there'll be a fairly significant increase in entitlements, that actually won't get to people. And increasingly, the benefit freeze that we've seen will be a benefit cap freeze, because you notice that the benefit cap hasn't been increased with inflation or with anything else. And so if things go on in this direction, effectively, it doesn't matter if the government starts becoming a bit more generous with benefits, if those benefits are only before that limit, which is frozen. In other words, people's incomes will be frozen, and prices will go up, and people will get worse off. And that's basically all I have to say. I just think that it's just so striking, this just structurally, before you even look at what's happening to individuals. It's kind of not surprising that this is happening, because it is just built into the system.
Hold on, I'm gonna stop you. I know you're wrapping up anyway. I'm not doing my chairing work very well, because we need to leave time for Claire, of course. Claire from Child Poverty Action Group, who is a lawyer there and can talk to us about, well, what many of you might want to hear about, which is the Child Poverty Action Group's legal challenge to the benefit cap. Claire.
Thank you. I will just share my screen as well. Have you got that there?
Yes, we do.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to give a bit of a whistle-stop tour of CPAG's legal challenge to the revised cap. So this is the second benefit cap case to reach the Supreme Court. And I've put the case names on the slides there in case you want to look them up afterwards. And it's also alongside the earlier case that went to the Supreme Court of SG. So our clients in the DA and DS case were 2 single mothers with young children who were affected by the cap. The claimant's case in the challenge was that the revised cap unlawfully discriminates against lone parents and their children, because it's much more difficult for them to work enough hours to escape the cap due to their childcare and care and responsibilities that they have. So it's argued that lone parents with children under 5 and under 3 face these challenges particularly acutely as well. So the claimant's case has highlighted the disproportionate impact of the policy on lone parents across the board. And that was not only in terms of high percentage of capped households that are headed by lone parents, but also in the way that the cap itself is structured. And in response to this apparent difference in treatment of this particular group, the Secretary of State therefore had to justify to the court why she had introduced a policy in a way that had such a disproportionately adverse effect on lone parent households. So as lots of people listening may already know, the court ultimately found in favour of the Secretary of State by a narrow margin, but the issues divided the 7-judge panel, and the judgment included 2 strong dissenting opinions from Lady Hale and Lord Kerr. So the majority of the court wasn't able to say that the different treatment of lone parents met the required test of being manifestly without reasonable foundation in order for it to be considered unjustified. This was partly because, having considered how the case law of the European Court of Human Rights applied, the court characterised the challenge in such a way that meant that what had to be justified was the Secretary of State's failure to make an exception for from the cap for lone parents, which arguably made it a lower bar than if they'd had to justify the disproportionate impact on the group as a whole. So in defending the policy to the court, the Secretary of State relied heavily on the policy aim of work incentivisation, and also relied on the mitigating factor of access to discretionary housing payments, or DHPs, which we've heard a bit about already today, and that are available for those facing a shortfall in their housing costs. The court took notice of evidence from Shelter as intervener in the case on various problems that families face when they are forced to rely on DHPs, and also of evidence from CPAG on the effects of the cap pushing families well below the poverty line. There is evidence before the court on the effect of poverty on children, including on their health, their education, and happiness, which was supported by findings from Professor Jonathan Bradshaw. So although the overall conclusion of the court was very disappointing, there were some positive legal developments, at least in my view, to come out of the judgment. They included confirmation that access to benefits falls within the ambit of the right to family life under Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and also the recognition that the government's compliance with Article 3 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was relevant to the overall analysis of whether the policy was manifestly without reasonable foundation. So although the Convention on the Rights of the Child isn't directly incorporated into domestic law, although in Scotland at the moment there are steps being taken for it to do so, it nonetheless requires the government to make the best interests of children a primary consideration when introducing policy that might affect them. So there were some questions in the chat earlier about sort of what's possible now in terms of legal challenges. Following the Supreme Court's judgment in May 2019, CPAG have considered pursuing a challenge to the European Court of Human Rights on behalf of a lone parent with young children. This would be a really long process, so potentially, and due to the nature of the cap, some people will come in and out of being capped, and also might understandably not want to have a long-running legal case alongside navigating other challenges that they might be facing. But if you do know someone who might be interested in helping us bring a challenge as a claimant who's been affected by it, then they can get in touch via the email on the slide there. Also, since the decision, CPAG and other organisations continue to look at ways of challenging particular aspects of how the cap's applied. For example, the CPAG's case of Pantellerisco, that's on the slide there, the High Court found that it was irrational to apply the cap to people who would be considered to be working enough hours to escape the cap if they were paid monthly, but who had been repeatedly subjected to the cap simply because they were paid on a 4-weekly basis and because of how their wages were processed by universal credit systems. We've also heard a lot today of particular issues relating to the coronavirus pandemic, one potential area where there might be scope for legal challenges there, excuse me, is how the grace period has been operating during that time. For example, those people on furlough might not have received their full wages at various points during the year. And so their earnings might have fallen below the threshold for escaping the cap, or for building up their earnings to be entitled to the grace period at a later date. And that was at a time when finding additional work just simply wasn't an option. Shelter are looking at this area in particular. And again, if you do know someone who's faced these issues, you can get in touch, and we can link you up. And thank you. And I will hand back to Katie.
Thank you, Claire. And we will have a little bit of time now for questions for Donald and Claire, but also widen it out in a minute to a wider discussion and perhaps some concluding thoughts if any of our panelists want to make them. But I have a couple of questions that have come in for Donald, which was first one from Thomas Weeks. He's interested to see the data on what proportion of people on benefits are able to meet basic needs with their income. I don't know whether you have something to say about that, Donald.
Yes, most not. I mean, we do reporting on how many reach the minimum income standard each year, and people who are wholly reliant on benefits, it's the vast majority. I believe it's something of the order of 90% who don't get up to the minimum income standard. But I mean, one thing I would point out is that there's a huge difference between being 10% below and being 40 or 50% below. And you know, because people who are out of work who have different sources of income, some have such child support and other sources, it isn't the case that everybody is that far below. But certainly the chances of you reaching the minimum income standard if you're wholly dependent on benefits is very small. And our research does also show that, you know, where you're sort of in this order of a 40 or so % below the standard, that people's the risk of obviously of you going into debt and being in severe crisis is greater. So unfortunately, you know, for those who don't have other resources, it is the norm that you have these incomes which are way below what you really need.
And here's a question for Claire from Bhavani Sama. Given the cap was lowered 4 years ago, what challenges have been made to keeping the cap at the lower limit? Has any of that been challenged?
So the second case, the CPAG case that went to the Supreme Court, was to the lower version of the cap. The SG case earlier on was to the higher version, the original one. I think because it only reached the Supreme Court last May, then there hasn't been a huge amount of scope since then to sort of revisit the policy as a whole since then.
And there's one from someone called Conor Drake from Bradford Council for you, Claire, which is with the introduction of the socioeconomic duty (brackets Equality Act 2010) result in different legal outcomes. That sounds like one from one lawyer to another, but I don't know.
So I think this links into the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that I mentioned. So that is one example of international law that contains socio and economic rights. And at the minute, you can't rely on any of those directly in the UK. And the DA and DS case shows how there are ways that it can still have a role to play in when policy is being decided. But I think if there was a direct route to rely on those rights, and that would be very helpful.
And Donald, a question for you from Ben Geiger. Why are there so few people hit by the benefits cap given what you've shown? Is it because most claimants don't have 2 children, or that not everyone claims for housing elements?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, we've only had good questions.
Sure, you'd expect there to be more and more. I think that one of the things that this was showing. I mean, one aspect of this is that I was showing the situation for couples. Now, a lot more people where there's no work in the family will be singles who are lone parents, and they're sort of a bit further down the road, but they're still moving in that direction. And another aspect of it is, I think that as you move more towards universal credit, I think there'll be a lot more people capped, because there have been people who've been more protected through certain forms of disability related benefits on I think in the legacy system, and I think there are fewer protections in universal credit. So it would be a good thing to research, but you'd expect there to be a big increase regardless of the COVID situation, just because of this sort of drift over time. And if there are a lot of people who are just below it now, then as prices go up and this is frozen, then you'd expect it to increase.
Thank you. I will keep throwing questions out there as they appear, but I'll also invite any of you panelists who, if you have any sort of concluding thoughts or things that you've picked up on as a result of listening to everyone else. But while you're thinking about that, Devon, there is a question for you from earlier, which is a processy one. Dan Manville says, over what period did you capture the data showing 80% of DHB applications are awarded?
It's a pretty consistent number from every local authority we've worked with. It goes up a bit when we start working with them, but it's basically between 70 and 90% when we first start working with them in terms of those that are actually applications to paid. And it's also a bit about the definition of need. So there's one other point I wanted to make. I do have to go because I'm getting, but there was just one final point I wanted to make, which is I think the benefit cap is much more of a policy that now reflects the failure to control housing costs than it does anything to do with employment. And again, its initial intent versus its actual impact in application is initial intent may be to do with employment, but its actual application is all to do with the inability to control the cost of housing.
I don't know whether thank you so much, Devon. I know you've got to go back in and make decisions about people, whether they go to prison or not. So hopefully it's not as serious as that, but perhaps it is. Did any of the other panelists have any thoughts on what Devon's been saying, or indeed any thoughts of your own to sort of wrap up as we're coming towards the end?
Yeah, well, I would say that slightly disagree about that last point that he made, because what my slides showed was that at the beginning, it was very much contingent on having high housing costs that you hit the cap. And increasingly, the design of the policy would hit more or less anybody in certain household categories who is renting and therefore is entitled to some form of housing support. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not, the housing costs make the cap worse, is what I would say, so that people then falling much further short as Aurora is because of having high housing costs. So they're not irrelevant, but without high housing costs, even with social housing costs, more and more people are going to be hitting the cap.
There is another question actually, which I like the beginning of it, not to ask a deliberately antagonistic question, ... So I'm just warning you, I haven't read it properly, but so read your arguments, all of your arguments. So read the arguments for the cap, that work should pay more than benefits do. What is the response to the fact that benefits aren't livable? And so actually the starting point should be livable benefits and then making employment pay. If any of you have thoughts on that question.
But we do make work paid through in-work benefits, and therefore you don't have people where you can take an identical situation where if somebody was in a job they'd be no better off. I mean, and that's always been the lie about the benefit cap, that somehow it's making you worse off by working than if you weren't, and it's just not true. And Kitty's nodding. I can see she agrees with me.
Everyone was nodding on that one, not me because I'm impartial, but I work for the BBC, but everyone else seemed to be nodding. There's lots of chat as well, Claire, about sort of other options on cases. I'm sure you've explored them all, but Ruth Knox, is there any mileage and discrimination in cases where someone who's been working and is now on maternity allowance and not entitled to SMP, has the benefit cap applied when maternity leave starts? That's for Claire.
Possibly, quite possibly. Email us on that test case email address and I will have a look at it. yeah, I'm interested to hear examples that people are seeing, welfare rights advisors are seeing with their clients, if they think there's potential challenges. So yeah, I'll drop that email in there again in the chat.
And Aaron or Kitty, do you have any concluding thoughts that you'd like to say as a result of this very informative, nearly hour and a half?
No, just to say it's the questions and so on in the chat have been really great and thought-provoking, and one really good idea, but I don't know if anyone knows how to do this. How do we get Marcus Rashford interested in the benefit cap? That might be our best way forward. If anyone's got any links, share them.
Yeah, I think a bit of Marcus Rashford sparkle would help any campaign. I don't have links, but somebody must out there. And Aurora, do you, having listened to all of this and been so powerful at the beginning, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share with us for the end? Any messages for government?
I'm just glad to be heard, to be honest. I mean, I feel like I've slipped through the cracks enough. There's been, points of my mental health, people asking me why haven't I applied for DHP and all these things. I think they only give you, I think DHP is only allowed for 3 months. And it's just, they are sticking plasters, the food banks, DHP, but nothing is there to address the situation. So I'm finally glad that something is happening. And
do you have hope that it will change?
Yes, definitely. We've got to have hope.
Humans thrive on hope. That is absolutely true. And thank you so much for sharing that all with us. I think just before we end, we've got, I think Ruth is going to do a final poll. I'd be surprised if views have changed based on the fact that everyone was against the benefit cut to begin with pretty much. But let's see. Ruth, do you want to take it and do your poll?
Yeah, thank you, Kitty. So I'll just, Kitty, I'll just try and launch the next poll, which is asking the same question. So I'm going to launch it now. So you should all be able to see it. And so I can see people are voting. So, and just while that's ratcheting up, just to thank all of you as well. So all the panelists for speaking, Katie for chairing, but also all of you that have come along and given up your time. We all know everyone's working under like massive pressures. So thanks for coming and being part of the conversation. And just as well, like a really big thanks to the funder, so Nuffield Foundation, who are funding the wider project and are making these discussions possible. We had a webinar on the 2-child limit now and the benefit cap, and I saw one of the people in the chat saying we'd like a follow-up event. So maybe that's a mission for us all to return to these issues, in a year or so or less than that and see what's happening. So I'll give it a second or two. Some of you are deliberating over it, so I'll give it a second or two still to run, and then I'll end it now, and then I'll share the results. So if I share the results, you should be able to see them on your screen. And actually it's interesting because it does show a shift in opinion in the course of the webinar. So when we started the webinar, and it may be that slightly different people are voting because people have had to leave or arrive, but at the beginning we found that 69% thought it should be scrapped altogether, but we're now at 86% thinking it should be scrapped altogether. And at the beginning we thought 21% just felt the benefit cap should be suspended, but that's gone down to 11%. So it may be that some of those who were thinking it should be suspended have now started to think, oh, actually it should be scrapped altogether. But I'll just hand back to you, Katie, if you've got any last words. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. That's hope in action, perhaps, as Aurora was talking about. Thank you all so much, particularly to Aurora, but to all of our panelists and to all of you who have spent the last hour and a half with us. I think for me anyway, it's been the most illuminating and really interesting conversation. There's so many numbers to take away and some devastating data that affects tens of thousands of people. And I think, yeah, we all need to take away and have a think about it. But thank you so much. We will watch this space, watch what campaign, the Poverty Action Group campaign do, and everybody here, we will look with interest and perhaps get some of it on Newsnight at some point, which would be really great. So thank you very, very much to all of you and to the sponsors, and see you next time. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie.